Picture this. You're standing in the muddy streets of London in 1441 when you hear the noise drawing near. Angry shouts, the rattle of iron chains, and above it all, the broken cries of a woman. Through the crowd, you spot her being dragged by armed guards, her dress ripped, mud streaked across her face, blood dripping from a stone's blow. The woman stumbling toward the Tower of London is Eleanor Cobb, Duchess of Gloucester, charged with witchcraft and treason. As she passes, you catch something in her eyes, not only fear, but a grim awareness. She knows this arrest is just the start of her nightmare. What waits for her inside those stone walls will tear away the last pieces of dignity, humanity, and hope she still has. You think you know about medieval justice, about dungeons and torture chambers. What you're about to hear will make Game of Thrones seem like a child's fairy tale. Because the way imprisoned women were treated in medieval times wasn't just about punishment. It was about breaking the female spirit through methods so savage most history books refuse to describe them in detail. Before we step into these forgotten tales of suffering and survival, if you like learning the hidden side of history, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. And drop a comment to tell me where you're listening from. It amazes me that we're sharing these ancient stories together from different corners of the world, connected across time by our curiosity for the past. Today, we're going to uncover what really happened to women inside medieval prison. What you're about to learn isn't taught in any school, because the truth was too disturbing for clean history books. These weren't just rough living conditions or harsh justice. They were planned methods of destroying women's bodies, minds, and souls with gendered cruelty that makes today's prisons look like luxury resorts. The horror began long before a woman stepped into her cell. Medieval arrests of women were staged as public shows that served many purposes: punishment, entertainment, and a warning to other women who might dare break their roles. When authorities chose to arrest a woman, they made sure it was in the most shaming way possible. Take the case of Marjorie Jourdain, called the Witch of Eye. Arrested in 1441, guards stormed into her home at dawn, dragging her from her bed still in her nightclothes, refusing to let her dress. Instead, they forced her through London's streets in her undergarments, while the crowd jeered, spat, and threw trash at her. This humiliation was no accident. It was policy. Medieval law ordered that accused women be paraded through crowded places to maximize shame and warn other. Town criers shouted out their crimes while crowds gathered to watch the spectacle. Children were even pushed to join in, throwing mud and stones while learning what awaited women who defied power. The violence during these arrests was both random and planned. Guards had no limits on how roughly they could handle female prisoners. Women were often beaten, their clothing ripped on purpose, their hair yanked out in handfuls. This wasn't just cruelty for fun. It was planned psychological warfare meant to crush their spirit before they even entered prison. Eleanor Cobb's arrest shows the most detailed record of this practice. As the wife of one of England's most powerful lords, she had lived in luxury and held respect from servants and courtiers. But when witchcraft charges arose, her arrest was staged to destroy her reputation. Guards came to her estate with strict orders to strip away every symbol of status. They ripped off her jewelry, ruined her fine clothes, and forced her to walk barefoot through London's foulest street. Witnesses saw her stumble and fall again and again, while guards laughed and refused to help her. The effect was just as intended. By the time she reached the tower, the proud Duchess was a broken, terrified woman. The laws around female arrests were kept vague, giving authorities wide freedom in how they treated accused women. Unlike men who often had certain rights in arrest, women were trapped in a legal gray zone where normal protections didn't exist. This loophole was used to excuse more brutal treatment. The role of accusers also shows the politics behind these cases. Women were often accused by rivals, rejected lovers, or family members hoping to steal property. The charges themselves might be lies, but once made, they led to automatic arrests that assumed guilt instead of innocence. Social class shaped arrest procedures in ways that showed medieval society's complicated views about female power. Noble women like Eleanor Cobb faced public shame meant to prove that their high status couldn't protect them from male authority. Merchant women faced different humiliations aimed at destroying their financial independence. Peasant women suffered the harshest treatment because they had no social safety at all. The intake process at medieval prisons was built to finish this dehumanization. New female prisoners faced what officials called an examination, but it was really organized humiliation disguised as security checks. Women were forced to strip fully, while male guards carried out invasive searches that had nothing to do with finding hidden weapons or goods. These searches were done in front of other prisoners and guards, increasing the shame. Women were made to take degrading positions while guards hurled crude comments and threats about what would happen if they refused to obey. The message was clear: your body no longer belongs to you. It belongs to us, and we'll use it however we want. Head shaving was another ritual meant to destroy feminine identity. Guards hacked off women's hair with dull blades, often cutting the scalp in the process. This wasn't only about stopping lice or keeping hygiene. Hair was seen as a woman's crown, her main symbol of beauty and womanhood. Cutting it away was symbolic castration meant to make women feel less than human. The clothing given after intake was purposely humiliating. Women received rough sackcloth outfits that were either far too big or far too small, making them look awkward and undignified. These clothes were also made to give easy access for guards who wanted to abuse prisoners without having to fully undress them first. But perhaps the most mentally crushing part of intake was how it forced women to take part in their own humiliation. Guards made prisoners thank them for the treatment, to show gratitude for being allowed to live, and to beg for basic needs like water or a place to sleep. This forced gratitude caused mental conflict that helped break down resistance to future abuse. Accounts from the time describe women leaving intake as completely changed people. The proud, bold women who had been arrested were replaced by hollow-eyed figures who moved with the careful submission of the deeply broken, and this was only the start of their torment. Medieval prison design was built with deliberate psychological impact in mind. The buildings themselves acted as weapons of fear, created to crush spirits through the environment before any official punishment began. Studying these structures shows how fully medieval leaders understood the link between physical space and psychological control. The Tower of London, where Eleanor Cobb was locked away, is the best example of this prison design. The giant stone walls weren't only defense, they were mental barriers made to make escape feel impossible and hope disappear. The thickness of the walls, the height of the towers, and the depth of the foundations all sent the same message of permanence to prisoners who knew they might never see the outside world again. Female prisoners were usually kept in the lowest levels of these prisons, sometimes completely underground. This placement was no accident. Medieval authorities knew that being underground created mental links with death and burial that would increase despair and obedience. The deeper a woman was held, the more fully she was cut off from life, light, and hope. The cell design followed strict patterns meant to maximize discomfort, while keeping the illusion of offering basic shelter. Cells were built just large enough to stop death from confinement, but too small for comfort. A typical female cell measured 8 feet by 6 feet, giving space to lie down but not to stand fully or walk more than a few steps. Windows, when they existed at all, were placed too high to see the outside world. Instead, they mainly allowed guards to watch prisoners while stopping them from seeing beyond their immediate prison. This created the feeling of being constantly watched while being fully cut off from normal life. The lack of proper toilets was no accident. Forcing women to relieve themselves where they slept and ate was planned humiliation, reducing them to animal level in their own minds. The mental toll of living surrounded by waste was well known and purposely used. Ventilation in women's cells was kept poor, creating air that was hard to breathe and impossible to escape. The stale, foul air served many purposes. It weakened women physically, caused constant misery that wore down mental resistance, and made the prison feel poisonous to life itself. Light was carefully controlled for maximum effect. Cells were kept in near total darkness, with brief moments of dim light given just often enough to prevent total sensory loss. This caused confusion about time, destroyed normal sleep cycles, and made it impossible for women to track the days. The sound design of medieval prisons was maybe their most advanced mental weapon. Cells were arranged so sound traveled in ways that heightened fear and isolation. Women could hear the screams and pain of others, but couldn't talk to them or tell exactly where the sounds came from. Stone walls made certain noises echo louder while blocking others, creating an environment where guard footsteps rang out in dread while conversations were impossible. The clank of keys, the slam of doors, and the rattle of chains became constant background noise, keeping prisoners in endless fear. Water was tightly controlled as another form of mental pressure. While enough was given to stop death from thirst, it was never enough for comfort or cleanliness. Constant thirst and the inability to wash caused physical pain that turned into despair. Temperature in medieval prisons was set by design to cause maximum suffering, year-round. Stone walls made cells freezing cold in winter and burning hot in summer, with no heating or cooling for relief. This constant physical pain blocked restful sleep and kept stress levels high, making mental resistance harder. Food was delivered in ways meant to show power, not just to feed. Meals came at random times, sometimes early, sometimes late, sometimes skipped. This lack of order caused anxiety about basic survival that kept prisoners focused on immediate needs instead of escape or resistance. The upkeep of prison buildings showed a lot about medieval views of female prison. While men's quarters might be fixed when they became completely unlivable, women's quarters were left to rot. Collapsing walls, broken floors, and unsafe damage that caused deaths were simply ignored until disaster struck. Record-keeping systems tracked this suffering in shocking detail. Prison administrators wrote careful notes about cell conditions, listing which designs best broke women's spirits and which caused the most deaths. This information was used to build future prisons that were even more mentally and physically destructive. If you think the intake process was the worst part for medieval women, you haven't heard about the living conditions waiting for them in the dark dungeons and city prison. What passed for housing in medieval prisons was meant not only to hold women, but to slowly destroy them through planned neglect and deliberate cruelty. Newgate Prison in London provides the most detailed surviving records of women's condition, and those records reveal a system of horror that challenges our ideas of human decency. Female prisoners were locked in underground chambers first built as storage rooms for grain and wine. These spaces had no windows, no airflow, and no drainage for human waste. Women were packed into them like cargo in a ship's hold. A typical 12-foot by 8-foot cell might hold 15 to 20 women, making it impossible for everyone to lie down at once. They had to sleep in shifts, with some standing against walls while others tried to rest on floors covered in waste, rotting straw, and the bodies of the dead who hadn't yet been removed. The air in these chambers was so poisonous that new prisoners often fainted within minutes. The mix of human waste, rotting food, diseased corpses, and lack of fresh air created an atmosphere so deadly that guards described it as breathing liquid death. Women developed lung infections within days that often turned deadly within weeks. But perhaps most terrifying was the deliberate policy of placing women with violent male criminals. Medieval officials claimed this was because of limited space, but records show it was actually a planned choice meant to make sure female prisoners lived under constant threat of violence. Guards even admitted that mixing men and women was an extra punishment for women who stepped outside their roles. The mixing created a predator's world where stronger men could claim female prisoners as property. Guards not only allowed this but often helped it happen, sometimes selling access to certain women to male prisoners who could pay. Women had no protection from assault and no justice when it happened. Since guards saw violence as a proper extra punishment for female offenders, food was used as another weapon of control and humiliation. The official ration for women was 1 pound of bread and 1 pint of water each day. But this ration almost never appeared. Instead, they received moldy scraps, often filled with insects or rat droppings, handed out irregularly to deepen hunger and desperation. Women were forced to fight over these small rations, creating conflicts that guards encouraged and even bet on. Stronger or more cunning prisoners would steal food from the weaker, while guards laughed and gambled on who would live and who would starve. This planned scarcity turned women against each other, stopping the creation of support groups that might have helped them survive. Pregnant women suffered the worst of all. Instead of getting extra care or food, they were often chained more tightly to stop escape attempts, driven by maternal desperation. Women gave birth in the same filthy chambers where they were kept, with no medical help and no clean supply. Many babies died within hours from infection or exposure, but mothers were forced to keep the corpses until guards removed them, which could take days or weeks. Being trapped with their dead infants caused trauma so deep it drove many women into madness. The prison economy was set up to drain every possible coin from prisoners and their families, while giving back almost nothing. Basic needs like clean water, edible food, or medical care were sold as luxuries at high prices, meant to ruin family. Guards made extra money running these prison markets, charging outrageous sums for things that should have been basic rights. Families too poor to pay watched their loved ones waste away and die. Families who could pay often ruined themselves financially, only to find that guards kept inventing new charges and rules. The system was designed to squeeze maximum wealth while giving minimum relief. Disease spread without control in medieval prisons, wiping out prisoners in waves. Typhus, dysentery, scurvy and fevers swept through women's quarters again and again, but officials did nothing to stop them. Instead, these epidemics were treated as natural ways to lower numbers and reduce costs. Women who lived through these conditions for more than a few months came out as changed beings. Accounts from the time described them as walking skeletons with sunken eyes and trembling hands, their minds broken by endless fear and hunger. Many developed what we would now call severe mental illness, speaking to invisible friends, seeing visions, or sinking into states of total silence. The changes in season added new levels of torment, calculated for the greatest suffering. Winter brought freezing cold that killed the weakest, while summer brought unbearable heat that spread disease and madness. No extra clothing or relief was provided, leaving survival to chance rather than care. Water was also deliberately tainted to cause illness without quick death. Prison wells were dug near waste pits, making drinking water polluted with human and animal filth. The dysentery and other waterborne diseases that followed slowly weakened prisoners while letting guards pretend their basic needs were met. The work systems forced on women showed the money-driven side of their suffering. Women were made to do hard labor that earned profit for their captors, yet they were never paid. This included sewing, cooking, and cleaning tasks that were sold to outsiders while prisoners received only scraps to survive. Medical care, when it existed at all, was given by doctors whose loyalty was to prison officials, not to the sick. These physicians were often told to keep prisoners just healthy enough to avoid quick death, while denying any treatment that might ease suffering or improve their lives. The records kept about prison conditions show how carefully prisoner suffering was planned. Detailed notes tracked which conditions created obedience and which killed too quickly to be useful. This information was used to adjust prison life for maximum psychological control. The legal system that shaped how women were treated in prison was not an accident, but a built framework meant to justify oppression while pretending to serve justice. Looking at these laws shows how medieval society made gender-based violence legal, turning resistance into a crime itself. Medieval law codes treated women as a separate category from men, with different rights, different standing, and different rules of justice. The idea of coverture meant that married women had no legal identity of their own. They were treated as property of their husbands, who could order their punishment or imprisonment without consent. Unmarried women had slightly more independence in theory but little protection in practice. This left them easy targets for charges and arrests, since no male protector could defend them or hire legal aid. The crimes that led to women's imprisonment were also different from those applied to men, showing society's obsession with controlling women rather than simply punishing harmful acts. Women could be jailed for adultery while their male partners went free. They could be imprisoned for gossiping, skipping church, or showing too little respect for male authority. Witchcraft accusations give the clearest example of laws made to target women. While men could in theory be accused, most cases involved women, and the trials assumed guilt before evidence was even heard. Standards of proof were lower for women than men. A woman could be condemned on rumor, anonymous claims, or confessions forced by torture, things never accepted in cases against men. The way women's voices were treated in court was even more revealing. Their words were considered less trustworthy than men's, leaving female prisoners unable to defend themselves or report abuse. Their testimony was dismissed, while their accusers' words were believed without question. Property laws created even more danger, making prison a weapon for men seeking women's land or wealth. Women who inherited property could be accused of false crimes, forcing them to surrender their assets to pay prison fees or court costs. The bail system also kept women locked up longer than men. Bail for women was set higher based on the belief they would run away, and most women could not access family funds because male relatives controlled money. Legal help for women was rare and often poor, while rich men could pay skilled advocates. The few lawyers women could afford often had ties to the very officials prosecuting them. Courtrooms themselves were designed to crush female defendants. Women had to stand through long trials, speak only when questioned, and face all male judges who openly ignored fairness. Sentences showed a clear double standard. Women were punished more harshly than men for the same crimes, based on the belief that female criminals broke not only human law but natural law by defying their expected roles. Appeals were nearly impossible. Men sometimes had ways to challenge verdicts, but women were expected to accept punishment with silence and obedience. Pardons were also rare unless women could offer something that male authorities wanted, creating new chances for abuse. Mercy was treated as a trade, not a right. Surviving documents reveal how deeply this anti-female bias was written into law. Courts described the same acts differently, depending on whether a man or woman did them. Men's actions seen as understandable, women's as shameful or criminal. The overlap of civil and church law made things worse. Crimes by men stayed in civil courts, but the same acts by women often went to church tribunals, where rules were stricter and punishments harsher. Medieval justice went beyond locking women away. It demanded their humiliation using punishments that attacked female identity. Stocks and pillories were redesigned for women to make public shame worse. Men were locked by head and hands, but women were placed so their bodies were exposed to crowds. Guards tore clothing and arranged positions to invite harassment. The case of Agnes Hancock, jailed in 1468 for adultery, shows this clearly. She was put in stocks in Canterbury's Market Square with her bodice cut open and her skirts pinned up, exposing her legs. Officials claimed this fit her immoral crime. For 3 days, she endured constant abuse while guards urged on the crowd. Public flogging of women also followed rules meant to increase shame. Women were stripped to the waist and whipped in busy squares, chosen for maximum visibility markets, churches, and festivals. The whipping itself was staged as entertainment, with women positioned to show their bodies and whippers told to strike so clothes fell away slowly. This turned punishment into a show that fed public cruelty as well as law. The ducking stool was perhaps the most extreme gendered torture invented by medieval rulers. It was used on women accused of gossip, adultery, or disobedience, combining shame with the risk of drowning. Women were strapped to wooden chairs attached to poles and lowered into rivers, ponds, or special pools. The act was designed for spectacle. Often women were stripped, tied down, and dipped slowly as crowds laughed. How long they stayed under depended on the operator, leaving women unsure if each plunge would be their last. Many drowned, but officials called these accidents. Joan of Arc's imprisonment gives the most famous example of psychological torture aimed at female identity. Beyond chains, she faced constant threats of assault from guards who told her what would happen if she gave up male clothing for a woman's dress. The threat of rape was used to push her into choices that would break her divine mission. Her captors knew that for Joan, being forced into female dress was not just humiliation, but spiritual defeat. They exploited this, leaving her to choose between keeping her identity and facing assault, or submitting and betraying her faith. This shows how deeply medieval authorities understood the power of gender identity and control. Branding and mutilation of female prisoners focused on body parts linked to womanhood and childbirth. While men might be branded on the hand or forehead, women were often marked on breasts, thighs, or other private areas, leaving permanent damage that ruined their chances of marriage or motherhood. These punishments made women socially invisible, even if they survived prison. The scold's bridle, used on women accused of speaking out of turn, mixed physical pain with symbolic silence. This iron cage locked around a woman's head held sharp spikes that pierced her tongue if she tried to speak. Women sometimes wore it for days or weeks, suffering lasting damage to mouth and throat while standing as living symbols of forced silence. Pregnancy offered no protection and often made punishments worse. Pregnant women were flogged with blows aimed at the stomach, causing miscarriage. Mothers who gave birth in prison often had their infants taken away and killed in front of them as added punishment. The blending of religion and cruelty added more suffering. Women accused of witchcraft or heresy faced punishments shaped to their alleged crime. They might be forced to confess false dealings with demons, describe fake rituals, or submit to body searches for devil's marks. These examinations were carried out by male clergy who used religious power to cover abuse as spiritual testing. Women were stripped, probed, and violated, told that resistance proved guilt and obedience showed repentance. Under this religious framework, any protest looked like rejection of God. Public executions of women became staged shows of humiliation instead of solemn justice. Women were partly stripped, supposedly to prevent hidden weapons, but really to provide one last spectacle for the crowds. Everything about the timing, staging, and methods was designed for shame rather than justice. These public punishments didn't just scar the victims, they terrified other women watching, reminding them what happened if they stepped outside their roles. Such events were used as public terror against all women. Authorities encouraged large audiences, announcing punishments in advance and even turning them into festivals with food and drink. Children were urged to attend and take part, learning from an early age what society demanded of women and how it punished defiance. Records of these events prove how calculated they were. Officials carefully noted public reactions, tracking which punishments stirred excitement and which created pity that might weaken their effect. This data was then used to improve punishments for maximum impact. While public displays warned society, the worst suffering happened hidden inside prison walls where no one could see or record it. Behind stone cells, female imprisonment became slavery masked as justice. Power inside medieval prisons left women completely exposed to every man in authority. Guards, wardens, priests, and visiting officials who knew these prisoners had no rights, no family protection, and no hope of escape. Abuse was not only tolerated but treated as a normal privilege of male power. Guards built systems where women were forced to provide services for anyone able to pay. These setups were so routine that guards kept customer lists, scheduled times, and divided fees among staff in strict order. The most valuable prisoners were women from rich families who might one day be ransomed or freed. These women were reserved for wealthy clients, local nobles, rich merchants, and church leaders who paid high prices for access to women of high rank. The cruel irony was clear. The higher a woman's status before, the more she was sold as a commodity in prison. Religious leaders played some of the darkest roles in this exploitation. Priests signed to hear confessions from female prisoners used the process as a chance for abuse, claiming that physical exams of their bodies were needed to judge the state of their souls. Women were told that resisting these exams proved sinfulness and guaranteed damnation. The confession booth turned into a place of systematic assault disguised as spiritual guidance. Women were forced to describe supposed sins in graphic detail, while priests demanded services as penance for their crime. The religious setting made it impossible to refuse or report this abuse without looking like they were rejecting God and condemning themselves forever. Monastery prisons run by religious orders were especially notorious because they mixed spiritual authority with total isolation from outside oversight. Monks who had sworn vows of celibacy used female prisoners to satisfy their desires while claiming these acts were spiritual exercises to test their devotion. Women were told that serving the needs of holy men counted as penance that might reduce punishment in the afterlife. This twisted theology made resistance feel not just useless but spiritually dangerous, pushing broken women to rationalize their own exploitation. The trading of female prisoners among guards added more layers of abuse. Women were gambled away in card games, given as gifts to supervisors, or sold for cash to supplement guard wages. Their bodies became a form of currency in a system where they had no value except as commodities. This commodification even extended to reproduction. Pregnant prisoners were sometimes sold to wealthy families desperate for heirs, with the understanding that their babies would be taken at birth and raised as legitimate children of their buyers. Women who resisted were beaten until miscarriage, then punished for destroying property. With no legal protection, resistance only made things worse. Medieval law offered no defense against authority, and complaints of abuse were treated as new crime. Women who reported assault were often charged with seduction or adultery, facing harsher sentences for corrupting guards. Chronicles hint at these abuses without saying them outright, suggesting writers knew what was happening, but found it too dangerous to record directly. Mentions of women entering prison healthy but leaving broken, of prisoners dying mysteriously, and of guards profiting from unspecified services, appear throughout medieval records. Pregnancy rates provide the clearest evidence. Women entered prison at one rate, but records show many became pregnant while incarcerated in supposedly male-free facilities. These pregnancies were twisted into proof of women's moral corruption instead of evidence of abuse. Economic exploitation went hand in hand with sexual abuse. Guards discovered that women could be forced into labor for outside customers, with all profits going to officials. At night, women were taken from their cells and delivered to guard quarters, forced to serve paying clients from outside the prison. The psychological toll was catastrophic and intentional. Guards knew that breaking women's spirits made them easier to control. Women who clung to dignity were beaten with increasing brutality until they submitted. Many developed what we now call dissociation, mentally separating from their bodies during abuse to survive. Others retreated into madness, creating fantasy worlds of meaning or rescue. These coping methods kept them alive in the moment, but left permanent scars that made life outside impossible. Silence made the abuse even worse. Women were told no one would ever believe them, that their word as criminals was worthless against respectable guards. This forced silence meant survivors carried their trauma alone, unable to warn others. Records from foreign visitors, diplomatic letters, and comparisons across kingdoms show that this wasn't just an English practice, it was common across medieval Europe. The systematic abuse of women in prison wasn't only about power or cruelty. It was mainly driven by money, making women's pain profitable for everyone tied to the medieval justice system. Looking at these financial motives shows how fully women's bodies and suffering were turned into products inside institutions that treated misery as a renewable resource. Running prisons was costly, requiring funds for buildings, staff, and daily needs. Authorities discovered that female prisoners could generate income that not only covered these costs, but made imprisonment profitable for those in charge. The clearest source of money came from selling access to women, controlled fully by guards and administrators. Unlike male inmates, who could be dangerous to customers, women posed no risk and could be easily controlled, making them ideal assets for profit. Prices for access reflected medieval market logic. Younger women were worth more than older ones. Noble women cost more than peasants. Virgins were the most expensive, while women already abused were offered at cheaper rates to poorer buyers. Customers came from all levels of society, including respected church leaders, officials, merchants, and even visiting nobles who treated imprisoned women like rented property. Pregnancy created another stream of profit. Children born to prisoners were sold to rich families, seeking heirs, or to religious groups wanting servants. Pregnant women were often kept in prison past their sentences until they gave birth, with their babies claimed as property of the prison rather than their mother. Beyond this, women were forced to labor, spinning textiles, preparing food, cleaning, or making goods, all of which generated income for captors while the women received nothing. Female inmates were especially used for textiles, since society considered it women's work. Workshops inside prisons made clothing, tapestries, and fabric goods later sold to outsiders, many of whom had no idea the items came from enslaved women working under brutal conditions. Care for female prisoners was calculated to save costs while keeping them barely healthy enough to work. Food, clothing, medicine, and shelter were supplied at the lowest possible level, while still protecting their ability to keep producing value. Families of imprisoned women became yet another income source through endless fees. Basic needs like clean water, decent food, warm clothing, or medical care were sold as luxury services, often draining whole households of their savings. Relatives were told their loved ones were suffering and might die without paid extras, forcing families to sell land, animals, or borrow money to cover costs for care that was rarely delivered. More money was extracted through paperwork, permits, certificates, and permissions for any interaction. Visiting rights, letter delivery, or even updates on health were all charged separately, with prices rising as desperation grew. Auctions created direct markets where women were sold to the highest bidder for set times or tasks. These sales ran like livestock markets, with auctioneers describing women's skills and traits to potential buyers. Prices shifted with the season. During harvests, demand for farm labor raised values. In winter, women skilled in textiles brought higher bids than those fit only for field work. Rental contracts spelled out exactly what buyers could do, showing the total commodification of women's bodies and work within legal systems that treated trafficking as normal business. Local economies and culture also shaped pricing, with variations in value depending on region and prisoner type. Areas with strong religious influence often paid higher prices for women accused of witchcraft or heresy, while trade hubs focused on buying women with useful work skills. The resale of female prisoners built secondary markets where women who had proven profitable could be sold again to other prisons or private buyers who wanted certain workers or servants. These sales ignored the women's wishes or family ties. International trading of female prisoners linked prison systems across borders, with women taken hundreds of miles from home to serve strangers in foreign lands. These trades brought huge profits to prison operators, while making escape or rescue almost impossible. The role of religious institutions in abusing female prisoners was one of medieval society's darkest contradictions. The same church that preached mercy and compassion ran prison systems often harsher than secular ones, using theology to excuse practices that would be seen as crimes elsewhere. Monastery prisons spread across Europe as supposed alternatives, claiming to offer Christian kindness and guidance. In truth, they became testing grounds for new ways of inflicting pain, disguised as holy discipline. The idea of penitential suffering gave cover to practices that were torture in all but name. Women were told that pain and humiliation purified the soul, that accepting abuse without protest showed proper Christian obedience, and that resisting proved their continued sin. Confession in monastery prisons was twisted by clergy who used it to demand intimate details while claiming spiritual need. The confessional became a weapon, turning faith into a shield for abuse, while leaving victims no safe way to report crime. Celibacy vows made exploitation worse, as monks and priests secretly used female prisoners while justifying it as spiritual testing or penance for both sides. Religious facilities practiced disciplines that mirrored torture in secular jails, long enforced silence, harsh fasting disguised as devotion, and isolation presented as holy reflection. Behind religious language, the same profit motives thrived. Monastery prisons earned money like secular ones but enjoyed tax breaks and protections, making them even more lucrative. Religious education for prisoners was little more than indoctrination, teaching women that resistance was sinful, that suffering was holy, and that questioning their treatment meant weakness needing correction. Some women who died under abuse were later canonized as saints, turning victims into propaganda that justified more suffering for others. The Inquisition perfected these systems, developing methods aimed especially at women accused of heresy or witchcraft. Their torture was often more refined and psychologically crushing than that of secular courts, hidden under the cover of doctrine. Religious networks also moved women between convents and monasteries across borders, disguised as pilgrimages to avoid scrutiny, making escape impossible while earning money for religious order. Sacred texts were reinterpreted to make submission, suffering, and obedience seem divinely required, while training of clergy included manipulation tactics disguised as pastoral care. Monks and nuns were taught how to break down women emotionally, making them dependent on their captor. Medical treatment in these prisons shows how suffering was ignored whenever it clashed with church power or beliefs about women's nature. Medical knowledge, limited as it was withheld or turned into another tool of control. Women's illnesses were blamed on moral failure rather than real causes. Excusing denial of treatment, doctors were told to see sickness as proof of spiritual corruption. The humoral theory provided easy explanations for female suffering without requiring any cure. Pregnancy was treated only in terms of unborn children, while the mother's health was ignored. Exams were invasive and degrading, justified as concern for the fetus. Childbirth focused more on proving paternity than protecting mother or child, with attendants recording details instead of giving care. Mental health issues were explained as demonic possession or punishment, never as trauma from prison life. Women showing symptoms were subjected to exorcisms that acted as further torture. Pain relief was minimal, withheld as punishment or given only as reward for obedience, rather than real medical need. Infectious diseases spread unchecked through filthy prisons, seen not as preventable but as deserved punishment. No effort was made to clean water, improve sanitation, or separate the sick. Surgery on female prisoners was often experimental, with women used as test subjects for techniques that doctors would never risk on free patients. Excused as training for students. Medical records were carefully kept, but only to study how abuse affected health data used to increase suffering rather than prevent it. Knowledge of nutrition was ignored when designing meals. Authorities knew hunger weakened resistance and shortened lives, making starvation an effective control tool. Pharmacy systems in prisons were built not to heal but to make money, with medicines sold as overpriced commodity. Medications were sold at high prices to prisoners' families while being watered down or swapped with useless substances that gave no real medical help to those who took them. Despite the heavy suffering forced on them, some imprisoned women developed remarkable ways to survive mentally, showing both human strength and the limits of prison control. Learning about these survival methods gives us insight into how people can hold on to dignity and sanity, even in conditions meant to destroy both. Mental separation became a key survival tool for women who needed to protect a core sense of self, while still obeying their captor. These women learned to split their actions from their identities, carrying out expected tasks, while keeping inner resistance that fueled hope for freedom or revenge. Secret support networks among female prisoners required immense bravery and cleverness, since guards worked hard to stop such bonds. Women created coded ways to talk, secretly shared resources, and protected one another, giving both emotional strength and practical help despite constant watch. Religious resistance appeared in different ways as imprisoned women reinterpreted Christian teachings to fight back instead of submit. Some built personal beliefs that framed their suffering as temporary trials rewarded in the afterlife, while others decided that earthly rulers claiming divine approval were really forces of evil to be resisted. Holding on to memories became another form of resistance, as women worked hard to remember their past lives, families, and identities. Even though prisons tried to erase these ties, memories acted like anchors that stopped complete loss of self and kept alive hope of returning to normal life. The rise of alternative hierarchies among prisoners allowed some women to lead and hold dignity even while locked away. These informal power groups worked alongside official prison control, offering help and organizing resistance against the worst guards and rules. Sabotage efforts ranged from small acts that disrupted daily work to bold property damage that showed defiance while avoiding discovery. These actions gave women satisfaction, cost their captors money, and proved that even the powerless could push back. The keeping of cultural traditions among women from different backgrounds created identity in communities stronger than the divisions forced by prison authorities. These practices offered comfort and preserved ties to life outside the walls, feeding hope for relief. Hidden teaching among literate prisoners helped keep minds sharp and passed on useful skills for survival or escape. These secret schools carried on despite bans on prisoner contact and showed deep commitment to growth even in impossible settings. Artistic creation also found ways to survive, with women making hidden works of beauty and meaning despite harsh conditions. These creations provided emotional relief and proved their humanity even as institutions tried to reduce them to obscure. Secret records kept by literate prisoners documented abuse, creating evidence that could be used if justice ever became possible. These hidden writings took extreme bravery and were acts of preserving truth against institutions that tried to control all stories about prison life. The abuse of imprisoned women had huge effects on medieval society, spreading far beyond the prisons to shape families, economies, gender roles, and cultural views of justice. Families of imprisoned women carried shame that often lasted for generations, as communities saw their jailing as proof of corruption that stained whole family lines. This social rejection brought money problems and marriage troubles, affecting many people for every woman actually locked up. Economic damage spread as women who had done key work were suddenly gone. Small shops closed, farms went untended, and homes fell apart when women who managed them were taken away. Marriage patterns shifted as families feared ties to households with imprisoned women. These changes altered inheritance, alliances, and social status, reshaping medieval society. Children suffered greatly when mothers were jailed, since there were no systems to care for them. Many died of neglect, were left to extended families, or were sold into servitude. Legal rulings against imprisoned women spread to wider restrictions on all women, limiting their rights for centuries. Religious teachings shifted to justify abuse, embedding ideas of female suffering and submission deep into Christian culture. Economic systems built on exploiting imprisoned women later expanded to other groups like the poor, minorities, and rebels. The punishment of women who resisted authority shaped cultural views, making later generations more obedient and fearful. Violence against women became normalized, spreading from prisons into homes as men grew used to seeing female suffering as normal. Even international relations were affected when foreign noble women were abused, causing political disputes and changing alliances. The deliberate erasing of women's experiences from history added another layer of violence, silencing their suffering from future memory. Chroniclers avoided writing about abuse to protect the reputations of church and state. Surviving records show bias, with court cases hiding the worst crimes. Archaeological evidence from prisons, foundations, waste pits, and graves shows harsh realities that official records denied. Turning some imprisoned women into saints was another way institutions twisted their pain into tools for propaganda instead of truth. Modern historians have often been slow to face this violence, continuing the silence begun in medieval times. This neglect has kept women's suffering invisible, yet the influence of these abuses can be traced for centuries, shaping laws, societies, and gender roles well beyond the Middle Ages. Comparing with other times and regions shows this violence wasn't unique, but part of a repeated human pattern. Studying it helps us recognize similar abuses today. Restoring women's voices through documents, archaeology, and new research is an ongoing effort to bring their hidden experiences back into history. Education that ignores these abuses continues the erasure started by medieval rule. Facing this requires centering women's experiences in historical study. The torture and exploitation of imprisoned women in medieval society stands as one of history's clearest examples of systematic violence disguised as justice. These were not accidents but carefully built systems meant to control women through fear, while profiting from their pain. The scale and planning reveal a society deeply invested in female oppression, presenting it as natural and holy. Economic incentives fueled the abuse, turning pain into profit, while theology was twisted to justify cruelty. Psychological techniques were refined over generations to break women's will and identity. The legacy spread far, shaping views of women, power, and authority for centuries. Recovering these stories means resisting the long erasure of women's suffering from history. Modern awareness of these patterns helps us spot and fight present-day abuses built on similar methods. The strength of the women who endured these horrors while keeping dignity and humanity inspires today's struggles against oppression. Their stories should not be lost as footnotes, but remembered as powerful examples of human resistance and survival. If you found this exploration of hidden history compelling, subscribe for more content that uncovers dark truths behind historical myths. Comment below on what other buried stories you'd like uncovered. The voices of medieval imprisoned women still echo across the centuries, calling for recognition of their pain and honoring their courage against systems that tried to erase them. By remembering them, we commit to resisting similar patterns today, ensuring their suffering was not in vain and their memory protects others from the same fate.